Well, certainly good to be with all of you today. Happy for another opportunity to study God's Word with you. And I'd like to continue this morning with another lesson dealing with the flood. You mentioned last week about the ark and how God took care, through Noah, took care of the animals on the ark, and how that was a feasible thing based on the size of the ark and the things that they could construct and the number of kinds of animals and so on they had on the ark. And we had a lesson the second hour dealing with the judgment of the flood and the salvation of Noah and how that relates to all of us as a warning that there's a judgment day coming for this world, a universal judgment by fire, and that we need to be saved by faith like Noah was saved, a faith that will act and do the things that God says. In this lesson, kind of want to look at just the world view and look at some of the evidence that there has been a global flood upon the earth. And, the description is often given about world views and how you look at things like looking through a different pair of glasses at the same evidence. And one person looks at it and they have this: there is no God, there are no miracles. Everything that we see around us is shaped by things that are going on right now, just by slow, gradual processes of uniformitarianism. You see a canyon, some little river cut that over millions and millions and millions of years, and you have what a little bit of water can do over a long period of time. Where the other view, which I think is the Bible view and the correct view, is that you look at the world around us and God sent a great flood, and you see what a lot of water in a short period of time can do is really the difference. And creation scientists set forth a lot of evidence from the world around us that indeed there was a global flood, just like the Bible talks about, that destroyed all living creatures, air-breathing creatures on the earth, and reshaped the surface of the earth. So you look at just an overview of the geologic evidence of the flood. There's fossils of sea creatures high above sea level all over the world. On top of all of the different mountain ranges, we see these fossils that are there, where animals by the billions were killed and buried in this sediment on top of mountains. Rapid burial of both plants and animals are found there. And I can remember one story I was hearing or reading in a book about a woman that was kidnapped by Indians and taken over the Rocky Mountains, and the Indians talked about the Great Flood and the seeing seashells and things on top of the mountains. So that idea is something that's evident all around us. The rapid deposit of sediment layers across vast areas where you have these layers of mud that have been laid down hundreds of feet thick. And you think about how a great flood that covered the whole world could lay down these enormous layers. Sediment transported over long distances. We have some of this sediment that goes from the Middle East all the way over to the western United States. It's all the same material that got laid down. And rapid layering of this different kinds of mud and sand, and yet there's no erosion layers in between, which you would think if it took millions and millions of years for this layer to go down, that there'd be all of this erosion in it. And then another layer got laid down, and it would be all eroded and so on. But we don't see that like when you look at the Grand Canyon. So let's look at some of these things in more detail. Here's a picture of the Himalayan mountains, Mount Everest. And even on Mount Everest, here you have these sea animals that are up there on the top of the mountain. So obviously that mountain used to be much lower to where it could be covered with water, and there must have been some high water, and then that mountain was lifted up because there all of these sea creatures that are buried there in the mountain. That the ocean floor we'll look at, if I get there, if we have time, about plate tectonics and how these different plates on the Earth. This is something that was kind of a new theory in the early 1900s, and yet it's pretty universally accepted now that you have these plates that cover the Earth with cracks in between, and they're moving. And during the flood, there was rapid movement of those things that drove up the mountains where they crashed together and so on. And there was a sinking of the ocean floor. The ocean floor rose evidently during the flood. That seems to be the evidence. You have these marine fossils that belong out in the ocean, and yet they've been carried way up on the continent. And so the ocean floor was lifted up. And when you look at the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, for instance, and these cracks go all around the oceans. They go around the Pacific Ocean as well. That there's volcanic material that comes up from the middle of that crack between those two plates in the mid-Atlantic ridge. And if you had all of the fountains of the Great Deep, we're told in Genesis chapter 7, that broke open, and all of that lava was coming up and heating the ocean floor, that the ocean floor was being replaced by some new material that was coming out that would be lighter when it was hot, and it would expand and be higher up, and it is thought that it could have raised the ocean level 3,500 feet. We have people panicking over, the ocean might be 6 inches deeper. It's a catastrophe. What if it was 3,500 feet more water that was coming over the continents? And think about the kind of work that could do on the surface of the Earth, that kind of water. I watched a video last week about the scablands up in Washington, these great canyons and ancient waterfalls bigger than Niagara Falls that were there. And people wondered for years what caused that. And it was finally found out during the Ice Age. There was a glacier had blocked a pass in the mountains, and a great lake near Missoula, Montana had built up, and that catastrophically, that ice dam broke, and all of that was carved out in a day up there in Washington. Giant canyons. That was 800 feet high. What if it was 3,500 feet high coming in? Can you imagine the type of canyons and reworking of the earth that would do? So you have all of these different areas of animals being buried successively. The most simple animals, in the ocean would be buried first up close to the beach, and further and further in you got the bigger animals and so on. And it's just like what we see in the fossil record, the way they're buried, from this uplifting of the ocean. And then all of that moisture coming down after the oceans being evaporated with those volcanoes around the world, and those things being lifted up. The world is a graveyard is the way that you can describe all of the fossil record that we have around the world. There was a whole planet's worth of animals and plants that were all destroyed at once. And so what would you expect to find after the flood? Well, you'd find these gigantic graveyards of animals being all piled up in these burial places, and you find it on every continent around the world. We find these animals in that way. There's a picture at figure 2 there is showing the Grand Canyon, and you see the different layers of different kinds of sandstone and so on that are there. The red limestone is 180 miles long, and all kinds of squid-like fossils of nautiloids are found buried along that in the bottom of it. Just millions of it that are there that you can go and see. And what buried all of those things at once, and what washed them all the way up there in Arizona that they put those animals up that high. There's many examples of marine and land animals all dwelling together. There in Tasmania, an island kind of southwest of Australia. There, a big fossil bed is found there, and you find all kinds of whales and different sea creatures, but there's also possums and land animals that were all washed together. Because this great flood, it gathered up these things and dumped them all over the place. And just find them all mangled. You don't find them all nicely put together, but something destructive happened to those animals. This graveyard, again, look at the thickness of those chalk cliffs that are found over in England. And then, of course, they're on the other side of the North Sea as well. They have those cliffs. And all of that was laid down at once. And when you take a microscope and you get to looking at what's inside that chalk that's there, it's all of those microscopic and small sea animals that are all making up that chalk. And so it shows, again, something catastrophic happened that buried a whole ecosystem in the ocean and piled it up and buried it in that chalk, that sand that's there. And it runs from Europe to the Middle East. Some of these beds stretch all the way from the middle of the U.S. all the way to the Middle East. That you drill down and you get to examining this layer, and it's the same material that's in it that's in Arizona. It's in the Middle East. Which shows just how massive these waves were and the material that they were laying down during the time of the flood. So a global scale of fossil graveyards. 7 trillion tons of vegetation are buried in coal beds around the world. When you examine some of the trees and things that are fossilized in the coal, they're hollow trees that we don't have nowadays that evidently grew out in the ocean, like around the edge of the continent. They had floating forests back there in Adam and Eve's day, and the people before the flood, different kind of plants that were growing that have been buried. And so that accounts for, you think, well, where did all of the plants come from to make all that coal and oil? Well, not only did you have what was growing on land, but evidently had around the outside of the continent a big forest, floating forest, that was also piled up and turned into coal and oil. Exquisitely preserved fossils is what we find. And you go through the museums, you find fine detail of these animals. They're swimming along and they just get, it's like you took a picture. You know, the mud just got them so quickly. This material's being carried by these giant waves and just swallows them and freezes them in place. Not some slow, gradual thing. You know, if you have something like a fish, or this is a jellyfish here at figure 11. How long can a jellyfish lay around on the beach before it just turns to mush, right? You can't make a fossil out of that. So this jellyfish had to be like frozen in place. And there's millions of them like that. Some great wave of mud came over and covered them all at once and froze them in place. You can see the trilobite there in figure 10. He's got very complex eyes that the scientists study, and it's all preserved there in the fossil where they can look at all of that complexity that's there. And you can see the animals that were really caught in the act. At the moment they were dying, the thing happened so quickly when the floodwaters arose and covered these different areas that one fish hadn't finished his meal. He was eating another fish and he gets frozen there in the rock. And also there's an ichthyosaur, one of those ancient dinosaur type of sea creatures that's giving birth at the moment that it was covered with this mud and frozen in the rocks. So billions upon billions. What would you expect to find if there was a great global flood like the Bible says in chapter 6 through 8 of the book of Genesis? Wouldn't you expect to find exactly that? That's exactly what that would confirm what the Bible says that happened. And that's the point of these things. Transcontinental rock layers. There's one layer of limestone, and I guess it's a deposit of the Tapete sandstone that's found in the Grand Canyon. And you can see it goes all the way from up in Maine. One big giant stream of water laid all of that down at once. Think about what would be involved in that, how much power that is. You know, it's amazing the things that happen when you increase pressure and you increase the speed of the water, what water can do. And talking about that flood that happened from Montana and went across the northern part of Washington, it was talking about that there are tornadoes of bubbles that drill these big sinkholes in the ground all along in some of these canyons in Washington. Don't see that every day with just a normal flood, but an 800-foot flood would do things like that. And what about this flood? 3,500-foot flood coming through. You even have more extraordinary things you couldn't explain as to why it did the things that it did. It's something we never see today. So you look at those, that big, thick layer of sandstone that's been laid down all the way across the country, all the way across the continent, and then you have huge boulders down at the base where it was rolling along with that water when it came through. And then there's a layer next to that of red wall limestone that was laid down. It goes from Tennessee and Pennsylvania. The same fossils are in it all the way to the Grand Canyon. So, yeah, another huge layer. Evidence of sediment laid down rapidly during the flood. The chalk beds of England go all the way to Kazakhstan over on the other side and above Iran. And you have that chalk that has been laid down all across there. Then these big beds of coal where all of those plants were all piled up and buried and turned to coal. Look at the big sheets of coal in the eastern part of the United States. All the same coal that was laid down there. All that material carried and buried together. Notice how you see that strip of coal going across here, and you see this in a lot of different pictures you can find. There's not a bunch of erosion in here. There's not a bunch of roots and things like at the bottom of a lake or whatever. It all got laid down in some catastrophic way all at once. And then another layer quickly got laid down on top of it. Evidence of rapid deposit. Again, here's that Coconino sandstone. It's 315 feet deep there in the Grand Canyon. It covers 200,000 square miles. And they examine the material that makes up that sand. That sand, you know, is been ground up for some rock somewhere else that turned it to sand. Well, where did all of this sand come from? Where are the rocks that these sands got washed off of? And they find out it's 2,000 miles away over on the East Coast somewhere is where that sand came from and ends up in Arizona. So, again, it's evidence of a great global flood that took place. And they can tell the direction that these sandstones were laid down by these ripples that you see where the water is flowing very quickly and it lays out, you know, these diagonal layers of sand as it's going along. And you see that in the Grand Canyon pictures, that it has this kind of direction to it. So they know it came from the north when it laid that down. They look at the next layer, and maybe it came from the northwest. They look at another, it came from the south, the next layer. So you got these waves coming in from different directions, big tidal waves, laying down these huge sediments of rock, and they can trace it back and see where that came from. That Ayers Rock, that's the big symbol of Australia. I think every time you go to to the steak place to eat, they have a picture of that because that's the symbol of Australia, that big rock that's out there made out of sandstone. Where did its sand come from? Well, it was several hundreds of miles away is where the original sand was, and it got dumped there in another spot by the water. So the soup-like slurry of sediment traveled at 70 miles per hour would lay down these things. Again, it shows the judgment of God clearly and God's power to be able to wipe out every air-breathing creature and all men that are on earth. see a demonstration of the power. That same kind of power, the world is reserved for fire. As sediment transported over long distances, there's grains of pure quartz that are found. That's why they're white in color. And water flowing from the north. The red wall limestone, water crossing from the northwest. And the Navajo sandstone that's also found there in the Grand Canyon. It's got zircon in it. It's got a radioactive decay rate of something or another, and so they can trace that zircon to another location where it came from. So all these things are used to show how far they were all transported from different places. There's the whole, the continent, and you can see how those layers just go on and on and on across the continent. Again, you see the smooth boundaries between all of these layers. Well, they're saying 100 million years for this layer, 100 million, and yet there's not erosion between. How could they be so flat? Uniform the way they are, unless they were laid down all at once. There's also bending of these layers that you see in the Grand Canyon and other places. And how did these segments of rock end up bending without breaking? If you take rock and you compress it, it's going to crack. It's going to put tension on it. It's going to split apart. It's what we see with rock. But evidently this was bent when it was still plastic, when it still had water in it, to where it could bend without cracking. And it was under the water when this uplifting of the mountains took place, and they began to shift these layers. You can see a picture there with some children at the Grand Canyon with those rocks that are bent and twisted in the way that they are. And the whole segment is bent. So how did that happen unless it was in connection with the global flood and then the uplift of the mountain while these things are still wet? The whole flood was 371 days that Noah was in the ark, over a year. During that period of time, a lot of great things took place. Plate tectonics is something, that we study. I had my minor in college was in geography, and we took a lot of earth science classes and things like that, and they were teaching this idea of plate tectonics at that time. There's a lot of nature programs on TV where they talk about it as an explanation for why we have earthquakes in California and in Japan, and why it is you have volcanoes in those places in the Pacific Northwest and along the west coast of the Americas all the way down, because there are two plates that are meeting there together. And it's causing the uplift of those mountains, and you have different ocean plates that are diving under another plate, causes that lava to be created that causes the volcano. So a man named Alfred Wegener, I guess is how you say that name, something like that, in 1912 came up with this theory, and in the beginning he was ridiculed. That he was saying, hey, we have these ridges in the ocean and all around there's all these plates, and that the earth is made up of these plates, and that's what formed the mountains and the volcanoes and the earthquakes and so on. And over time the evidence piled up, and now it's in all the textbooks that we study in college and in high school and so on. They teach this plate tectonics. And it is a big part of explaining what happened during the flood. They look at this movement of these plates from space with satellites, and they see they're moving, an inch to 6 inches a year. Maybe they're spreading apart. Very, very tiny, almost imperceptible, but still enough to cause earthquakes and problems around the world. But during the flood, we're told about some catastrophic splitting apart that took place, where this was sped up and it was just a chain reaction where you had one continent, you had Africa and South America. You can kind of see how they fit together. And, you could line them up with that continent that it split apart. And you had India is on a separate plate. It swung up and hit into Asia and made the mountains there, number 4 that's there. So instead of happening slowly, it happened quickly during that 1 year of the flood, that those continents began to break apart. And again, they're able to do chemical tests on the lava and the crust, showing that this is there's a difference between the waters in the material in the ocean and that of the crust underneath the continents. The continents are mainly granite, and they're lighter, they're less dense, so they rise up. Where this ocean is mainly basalt, it sinks underneath the continents when they come together. And looking at these different kinds of faults that we see around the world, some of them are pulling apart, like out in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. There's some faults that are colliding, like out along the west coast of the United States, where all of those mountains are being pushed up as the plates come together there. Some are just slipping by each other. Think about that San Andreas fault out there, where you got two plates going opposite directions, that every now and then they jerk past each other and cause some terrible earthquake to take place. And you have the seafloor spreading out. And our seafloor looks very new. It was all laid down probably during the time of the flood. That material was laid down there. So, evidence of colliding plates and rising mountains. You can see all of this in the textbooks. They have it happening over millions of years. But if you had a runaway subduction taking place, and there's been some different scans of the earth with all kinds of material underneath the continents, where it looked like a whole ocean floor got laid down there and got sucked under in the past, which would confirm again what the Bible has to say. Here's what it says about the end of the flood. In Psalms 104 and verse 6, it says, "You covered it with the deep as with a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. At your rebuke they fled. At the sound of your thunder they hurried away. And the mountains rose and the valleys sank to the place which you established for them. You set a boundary that they may not pass over, so that they will not return to cover the earth." God started this flood, and then he brought it to an end. He raised up the mountains through these different processes that he used, and he sunk the valleys down, and the ocean's floor cooled and sank back down, and the waters ran off. And that would have been pretty catastrophic too, all that drainage coming off. We see how big all of our river basins and things are, way bigger than our rivers are today. You have then the deep ocean again. Well, I hope that this gives you some thought about some of the explanations that are given by creation scientists, that when they enter into debates with these uniformitarian, atheistic type of scientists that control so much of our textbooks and stuff today, they have good scientific basis for the things that they say. They're not without answers on these things. And we need to share them with our children so that they can understand some of these things. I'm just scratching the surface. I'm a gospel preacher. I'm not a scientist, so I can't do justice really to all of this. Just kind of introduce it to your minds. I have several books just written about all of this stuff, where the whole book is about these things we've rushed through this morning. So I hope that you'll go to some creation science websites and look up some of the material that is found there. Buy some books that you can share with yourself and your children. This time, if you'll bow with me, we'll be dismissed into our classes.